we are living in a time that is extremely important for us, that we cannot be silent. There's a line, there's a demarcation that's being drawn. It's not being drawn by us. It's being drawn by those who want to pursue abortion. And when Roe versus Wade was passed, we kind of took a breath and thought, wow, well, now things are going back to the states. This looks like victory. Arizona is one of the first states that wants to codify abortion. It's going to be on the 2024 ballot, and it's going to make it a constitutional right in the state of Arizona to be able to take the life of an unborn baby. And this is important for us to understand. Now, I always say things like this. I say we are an issues-driven church. We will deal with any issue that is out there. We are not political. However, sometimes issues cross over into the political. And sometimes we have to deal with political issues because we're dealing with issues. And we're not going to not do that because it crosses over. So we really want today to speak to you about the importance of us being involved, because there's a real battle going on here. And I'll share a little bit with you after that once Frank is done. And we got kind of a 1-2 punch for you today. So please welcome Frank Turek.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's go back to 2003, 20 years ago this October. Senator Sam Brownback was the senator of Kansas in the United States Senate, and he actually showed a picture of a 21-week-old baby in the womb that was being operated on to correct a birth defect. Here's the picture. You can see the hand holding the finger of the doctor. Here's a better picture. And he showed this picture in the United States Senate, and the baby's name turned out to be Samuel. The baby was born, and so Sam Brownback said, is little Samuel's hand the hand of a person, or is it the hand of a piece of property? And Barbara Boxer, the senator from California at the time, said this: I am not a doctor and I am not God. I trust other human beings to make those decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have to be a doctor or God to know that that's a human being? No. And what are lawmakers supposed to do? They're supposed to make decisions about these issues. That's why we send them to Washington. If she can't make the decision, then maybe she ought not be a senator. That's what you're supposed to do. But you might say, as Pastor Robert said, we've got ballot issues coming up. I mean, can you really legislate morality? You always hear you can't. So I want to address that head on today. And we're going to try and do this in 3 steps. We're going to address the question directly, can we legislate morality? Then the second question, should Christians be involved in politics at all? Because you always hear people saying, oh no, just preach the gospel, don't get involved in politics. And then I want to address the question, should you ever disobey your government? Now I've got a warning for you. Here's the warning. I'm going to be correct, not politically correct. So if you're a little bit sensitive, I don't care, okay? My flight's at 3 today. Pastor Robert's going to have to clean this mess up later, okay? All right, so let's start right here at point 1, can we legislate morality? Let me ask you a question. Do you see all these issues up here? Abortion, life, marriage. There's even laws that suggest you have to participate in a same-sex wedding if you're a baker or a photographer or someone like that. There's laws about transitioning children, mutilating children, trying to make them another sex, which you can't do, but people try. Parental rights, and of course we have laws on murder, theft, and rape. Ladies and gentlemen, are these moral issues? Yeah, you always hear you can't legislate morality. You know what the truth is? All laws legislate morality. You can't think of a law that doesn't legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. That's what laws do. In fact, laws are the codification of morality. Unfortunately, in our country, sometimes now laws are the codification of immorality. And so we need to be engaged in this. Now, when you say things like this, however, people are going to say, well, don't impose your morality on me. Now, when people say that, I say, why not? Would that be immoral? And by the way, do you notice you're imposing your morality on me right now? You're saying I ought not impose ought nots. Why do you get to impose that ought not on me, but I don't get to impose any ought nots on you? In fact, all laws legislate morality. Actually, the better answer is when somebody says you ought not impose morality or don't impose your morality on me, I say, this isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that theft is wrong, that it's wrong to mutilate children, that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 2 said, the Gentiles are not of the law written on their hearts. Everybody knows objective right and wrong, whether you have the Bible or not. In fact, our country was founded on the moral law consistent with the Bible. It comes from God, but you don't need the Bible to know it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created and endowed by their government. No, not endowed by their government. Endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Rights come from God. They don't come from government. Governments are supposed to secure rights. And in our country, we get to secure the rights because you hear people say, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar. Do you realize in America you can be Caesar? You can certainly elect Caesar. Yes, we're supposed to be engaged. But when you say, yeah, we're going to legislate morality, people will say, the separation of church and state. Ladies and gentlemen, is the separation of church and state in the United States Constitution? No, it's not in there. It has to do with a Thomas Jefferson letter back in 1803. I don't have time to get into that now. But even if the separation of church and state was in the Constitution, it's irrelevant to this discussion. Why? Because we're not trying to establish a church. We're not trying to tell people by law they have to be a member of a church. We're not telling them where, when, how, or if to worship. That would be legislating religion. We're not legislating religion. We're trying to legislate morality. And that's what all laws do. Yeah, we're not going to tell people they have to be a member of a church, but we are going to tell people how they ought to treat one another. You see, there's a difference between legislating religion and legislating morality. Yes, they're related, but you can legislate morality without legislating religion. You say, well, Frank, you can't legislate it because it's in the Bible. Do you realize if you couldn't legislate anything in the Bible, you couldn't have any laws? You couldn't have laws against murder because thou shalt not murder is in the Bible. Did you know that? Are you saying we can't have a law that says thou shalt not murder? No, of course. We're not legislating it because it's in the Bible. We're legislating it because it's part of the moral law consistent with the Bible. It comes from God, but you don't need the Bible to know it. So the separation of church and state has nothing to do with this. We're not setting up a theocracy. We're simply telling people you need to treat other people in a certain way. And that's what all laws do. Every law does that. The only question is, what's the right morality to legislate? And I don't want to legislate my morality. I don't want to legislate your morality. I want to legislate the morality. All right, so all laws legislate morality. The second question is, should Christians be involved in politics? And I often hear people saying, oh, we can't get involved in politics. We just got to preach the gospel. Now, obviously, I think the gospel is important. It's among the most important things we do. But when people say, just preach the gospel, don't get involved in politics, what they're saying is the gospel is not very important. Why? Well, let me ask you this. What is this, ladies and gentlemen? Anyone know what that is? Yeah, that's the Korean Peninsula, a satellite imagery at night. You can see, there's the 38th parallel. We fought a war over that. South Korea is filled with light. It's filled with productivity. Many Christians live in South Korea. North Korea, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. There's one major reason for the difference between South and North Korea. What is it? Don't say electricity. What is it? It's politics. The South has political freedom. The North does not. Ladies and gentlemen, which country would you rather live in? Yeah, you'd rather live in South Korea. But do you realize that America has religious freedoms much of the rest of the world doesn't have? We just take it for granted. But you know, you can't have Calvary Chapel, North Korea. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. I mean, if you don't think politics are important, you haven't been to some of the countries I've been to. I've been to Iran, Saudi Arabia, China. Can you have Calvary Chapel, Tehran? No. Can you have a radio station in Saudi Arabia that preaches the gospel like 106.7 here, your radio? No, can't have that there. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. And so if you don't think politics are important, you don't think the gospel is important, because the gospel is affected by politics. Why politics is not our religion, politics affects our religion. In fact, it affects just about every area of life if you think about it. Politics affects your church, your family, your health, your money, your business, your freedom, your property, your school, your safety, the poor, the unborn, evangelism, your faith behavior. Everyone and everything is affected by the laws made in Washington, the laws made here in Arizona, and the laws made in your localities. So why shouldn't Christians be involved? Are you suggesting only atheists are qualified to run the country? Where did we come up with this idea? So if for no other reason you ought to be politically engaged is to protect your ability to preach and live the gospel. And you might ask yourself, what is the purpose of government? Why do we have a government at all? Well, according to the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, he told us what the purpose of government is. He said this: government is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. In other words, governments are instituted to protect innocent people from evil. Governments have the power of the sword, meaning the power of punishment, to protect innocent people from evil. If you don't have a government, a good government, you're going to have anarchy. In fact, we had anarchy in New York City back in the 70s when there was a blackout. What happened when the blackout occurred? A lot of people were murdered, shops were looted. In fact, we had it in 2020. How did the CHOP area of Seattle work out? No police protection. In fact, what do you think would happen here in Tucson if the police said, tomorrow, we will not prosecute any crimes. You can do whatever you want and you'll never be prosecuted for it. What do you think would happen? How many people would be murdered? How many homes would be burglarized? How many stores would be looted? Would Best Buy survive? Would the Lexus dealership survive? No, it would be anarchy. Why? Because we're bent toward evil. We need government involved to protect innocent people from evil. One of the most pithy things ever said about government was said by James Madison, the father of our Constitution, our 5th president, who said this: if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If we were angels and we were inherently good, would we even need government? No. The reason we need government is because we're inherently evil. Because it's easy to be bad, it's hard to be good. And of course, the scriptures teach this. Jeremiah famously said, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? You know we're depraved. If you ever brought up a 2-year-old, you know people are depraved, right? You don't have to teach the 2-year-old to say mine. He already knows that. You have to teach him to share. And every study of human behavior shows this. In fact, the Babylon Bee cited a study recently. 100% of men would eat any fruit given to them by a naked woman. You say, I'd have done better than Adam. No, you wouldn't. You'd have done the same thing. We're bent toward evil. You say, but really, why get involved politically? Christians haven't really made any progress in politics. You haven't been paying attention. You need to look at the long view. Look at the past 2,000 years. You know what Christians have been able to do politically? Christians have abolished slavery, gladiatorial combat, death games, temple prostitution, kidnapped brides, wives as property, infanticide, child labor, child marriage, child sexual abuse, child prostitution, and class distinctions, and in some states now abortion. Because Christians have been involved. If Christians weren't involved, these things would still be going on. Why shouldn't we be involved? In fact, if you're upset with the state of the nation right now, the moral state of the nation now, you know who's to blame? Go home and look in the mirror. You're to blame. I'm to blame because we haven't been engaged enough. We wonder why the culture goes godless when all the godly people get out of it. Why do you think that happens? It's not the liberals' fault. It's our fault. We're not engaged enough. We're not salt and light. We're too silent. We're too scared. We won't stand up. You say, well, the people in the Bible never got involved in politics. Au contraire. Look at all of these heroes of the Bible, all influenced governments and political leaders. Joseph, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Nehemiah, Esther, Nahum, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, John the Baptist, Paul, and Jesus. Jesus got involved in politics? Yep. In fact, which group did Jesus go after the most? The Pharisees. And who were the Pharisees? They were the religious and political leaders of Israel. Many of them were on the Sanhedrin. That's the Jewish ruling council to whom Rome delegated day-to-day legal-making authority. They told the Pharisees, you guys are in control here of the day-to-day lawmaking of Israel. They were politicians. And Jesus went after these people. In fact, what did he say? This is easy to remember because it's Matthew 23:23. Here's what he says. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former, you blind guides. You straight out in a gnat, but swallow a camel. Notice what he's saying. Yeah, you can applaud Jesus. Yeah, there's like 4 people in here going, I think that was okay, Jesus. Yeah, that wasn't bad. Notice he's saying they're tithing their spices, but they're neglecting the more important matters of the law. We're doing the same thing in America. We're telling people what light bulbs they can and can't use, what stoves they can and can't. Is that the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard? What cars they can and can't drive. But we won't tell people don't mutilate your children. Don't murder your children. Are we neglecting the weightier matters of the law, the more important matters of the law? Yeah, we are. And you know whose fault it is? It's our fault. Here's another way of looking at it. Should you love your neighbor? Is there any Christian that says no? Of course we're supposed to love our neighbor. Okay, a couple of questions. Should Christians care how people are treated? Is there any Christian that's going to say no? Of course we should care how people are treated. Next question. Should Christians care how people are treated by their government? Well, if you should care how people are treated, you should certainly care how people are treated by their government. Welcome to politics, ladies and gentlemen. You can't avoid it. If you're not going to get involved, who is? Are the atheists going to protect the innocent? In fact, maybe we can ask the question this way. In what part of life should you not follow or agree with Jesus? You should follow and agree with Jesus in every part of life. Not just here on Sunday morning when a few people you will clap for Jesus, but tonight at home, when you go to work tomorrow, when you go in the voting booth, when you live your life 24/7, you should always be following Jesus. How did we get the idea that we're not supposed to be engaged in caring for people through law? Where did we come up with that? It's stupid. Why should we be silent? Final question. Should you ever disobey government? We know we have to be engaged. What happens when the government goes evil? Let's suppose you're in Nazi Germany in 1943. You're hiding Jews in your attic. You get a knock at the door. Schnell! Schnell! You open the door. Nazi soldiers. Hast du hier Juden? You have Jews here? What do you say? First thing you say is, have you ever heard of a dentist? What's wrong with you showing up with that nasty grill at my door? Next thing you say is, I don't speak German. No, what do? Thou shalt not bear false witness. How many people are going to tell them the truth? You sinners. I submit to you, you are in violation of this Bible verse. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that what God has established. So they're at your door, has to hear you, and you have them upstairs, and you're going to lie? Aren't you supposed to tell the truth? Yeah, we got 3 up there. If you only see 2, keep looking. That third one, he hides pretty well. What are you going to do? How many are going to lie? Okay, sinners. Actually, there are no verses in the Bible. Did you know that? We talked about this yesterday for those of you that are here for the conference. The chapter and verse divisions were added 500 years ago to help us navigate the text. So it's hard to just pick out one verse and get a complete doctrine. Paul is stating here that generally governments are instituted to protect innocent people from evil, and you're supposed to submit to them, but there are exceptions. Can anybody think of exceptions in the Bible when people did not submit to government and were blessed by it? Anyone? Rahab is one, right? In fact, let's go before Rahab. We can talk about the Hebrew midwives in Egypt. Remember, they lied about how fast the Hebrew women gave birth because they wanted to save those babies. Pharaoh wanted the babies dead, just like Herod wanted the babies dead, right? But they lied. And you already mentioned Rahab at Jericho. Also, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You remember them from Daniel chapter 3. And of course, Daniel himself. Don't pray to Yahweh. He's praying out in front of everybody to Yahweh. And then, of course, in Acts 5, Peter and the apostles said, we must obey God rather than men, because the authorities tried to say, hey, you can't preach the gospel anymore. And they said, sorry, we got to obey God rather than men. Of course you disobey government on 2 conditions or in 2 situations. When they try and force you to sin, or they try and tell you you can't do what God told you to do. So if you're living in China right now, and you're pregnant with your second child, and they come up to your door and they say, are you pregnant? What are you going to say? No. Because you have a higher duty to protect innocent life than you do to tell the truth to a guilty murderer. This is called graded absolutism in ethics, that if you're put in a dilemma, you have a higher obligation to save a life than you do to tell the truth to a guilty murderer. So those of you all of you who said you would lie, you're taught well because you have Pastor Robert here, okay? Don't just take one verse. You got to look around at other passages to see what the complete teaching is. In other words, there's a moral hierarchy. And Jesus pointed out the moral hierarchy in several ways. We don't have time to go through all of the passages on this, but Jesus talked about the greatest commandment, which implies there is a lesser commandment, right? And greater love, greater sin, greater judgment, greater knowledge equals greater punishment. And we just talked about when he said the more important matters of the law. Now, when you think if there's a moral hierarchy, you might want to go back to the political question for a minute and say, does this mean that abortion trumps everything else? Is life the most important issue? I mean, what do you think Jesus would say? If you're concerned about some minor issue and yet people are being murdered, he's going to say you're neglecting the more important matters of the law. Not that you can't be concerned about every issue, but you've got to put them in the right priority. In fact, the right to life is the right to all other rights. Because people are going to claim you're a one-issue voter. I'm not a one-issue voter. I don't want somebody just to be pro-life. You can be pro-life and be awful on other issues, right? In other words, being pro-life doesn't necessarily qualify someone as a good candidate, but being pro-abortion disqualifies them as a good candidate. In other words, I'm not a one-issue voter, but I am a one-issue disqualifier. I'm going to disqualify you if you're saying you're pro-abortion. I don't care if you're good on other issues. If you don't get that one right, you're not worthy to represent the people in our government. You've got to know that the right to life is the right to all of the rights. Now, some of you may go, come on, Frank, it's kind of a fun exercise with the Nazis, but there's nobody coming to our door. All right, I'm just going to tell you what's happening now. You haven't been paying attention if you don't know this. But March 31st, 2022, President Biden, through his Health and Human Services Department, put out a memo that said that if you have a child who thinks he or she is the other gender, and you don't affirm that child in that other gender, which what they call gender-affirming care, that the government may come to your house and take your child from you. You think I'm making this up. It matters who you vote for. It matters who you put in office. Because when you have a government that's going to come to your door and say, your 4-year-old thinks he's a girl, give him to us. President Biden recently said, there are children. Did you hear him say that? I don't know if he was told to say that, but he said it. And what are you going to do tomorrow when you go to work and they say, hey, what are your pronouns? We talked about this during the session here yesterday. I don't have time to get into it now, but if you go to our website, or I should say our YouTube channel, the Cross-Examined YouTube channel, we just put up a video yesterday about this. What do you do when they ask you what your pronouns are? It's me and Greg Kokel talking about this, so you should go to the Cross-Examined YouTube channel to think about it. But the point here is that the world is closing in on Christians. And we not only have to put laws in place that protect our ability to preach and live the gospel, we should put good laws in place to protect even people that we don't know, people who are not Christians, because we're supposed to love our neighbor. And if we're not involved, who is going to be involved? People that are not going to vote to maintain religious freedom. They're not going to vote to protect innocent life. They're not going to vote to do what's right when it comes to transgenderism. We have to be engaged, ladies and gentlemen. And the way we need to be engaged is we have to transform our minds. As Paul said in Romans chapter 12, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. He's not talking about the will of God to find, who you should marry or what job you should take. He's talking about God's moral will here. And the reason you might not think this is all that important is because you have been more influenced by the culture than you have by Jesus. Your mind needs to be transformed. My mind needs to be transformed. Why is he telling us to do this? Because we tend to be conformed to the pattern of this world. In fact, when Pastor Robert's going to come up here in a couple minutes, he's going to challenge you on that. Are you conformed to the propaganda we're hearing? Or are you someone who has the mind of Christ? Now, we ran out of books yesterday, but the book that deals with this the most you can get on Amazon or our website, Correct, Not Politically Correct. This is about same-sex marriage and transgenderism. By the way, there's not a Bible verse in this book. This is the natural law, medical, common sense case why Christians ought to be involved in politics and why same-sex marriage and transgenderism are not good for individuals and they're not good for societies. All right? Also, if you would, text the word evidence to this phone number, 855-909-0582. If you text the word evidence to that phone number, 855-909-0582, I'm going to send you this entire PowerPoint presentation and about 5 others in a PDF format for free so you can look at it whenever you want, all right? Now, let's end this super uplifting, cheery presentation with more uplifting insights from Adolf Hitler, who talked about Protestant pastors in Germany. When he was in power, he said this: "You can do anything you want to Protestant pastors. They will submit. They are insignificant little people, submissive as dogs, and they sweat with embarrassment when you talk to them." Do you know most of the pastors in Germany caved to the Nazis? They didn't stand up. They were too scared, too silent. They said, "Oh, let's just preach the gospel." Again, I'm all for preaching the gospel, but the government can shut that down. Then what? One guy who wouldn't be silent was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor in his 30s. In fact, he thought Hitler was so evil, he was involved in the Valkyrie plot to kill Hitler on July 20th, 1944. 4 people were killed in that plot. Unfortunately, Hitler wasn't one of them. And when Hitler found out Bonhoeffer was involved, he had Bonhoeffer hung in the woods outside of the Buchenwald concentration camp in April of 1945, just a few weeks before the war ended. But prior to that, Bonhoeffer, who Eric Metaxas wrote a great biography of, Bonhoeffer said this: "Mere waiting and looking on is not Christian behavior. The Christian is called to sympathy and action, not in the first place by his own sufferings, but by the sufferings of his brethren, for whose sake Christ suffered." In other words, he's saying, we've got to get involved to protect innocent people, not just us, but other people who are being harmed by their government or harmed by other people. We need to stand up. If we don't stand up, who will? And there was a group in Germany of pastors called the Oxford Group. And this Oxford group thought that the solution to all this was trying to convert Hitler. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Bonhoeffer thought the same thing. In fact, here's what he said about the Oxford Group. He said, "The Oxford movement was naive enough to try and convert Hitler, a ridiculous failure to recognize what is going on. We are the ones that need to be converted, not Hitler." You see his point? We need to be converted. We need to live as Christians. Same thing is true in America. We don't need to convert Biden, Harris, or Trump, or DeSantis, or anybody else. We need to be converted. We need to stand for truth. Do you realize that half of the Christians in this country don't even vote? Do you realize you don't need to convince one leftist to vote the right way? You just need to wake up the church to stop being silent and to get involved and to stand for righteousness. If the church stands up, most of our political problems are over. And we need to stand up. We need to protect the gospel. We need to protect religious freedom. We need to protect innocent people from evil. We need to stand up. Look, I don't want to live in this country. You don't want your kids or grandkids to live in a country like that. If you don't want them to live in a country like that, you need to get involved right now and stop wimping out. Stand up for the truth. Pastor?
In all 50 states in the United States, if you are driving down the road and you look down for a few moments and you hit a car and you kill a woman who's pregnant, they will bring you up on 2 charges of manslaughter. That means that our entire nation knows that that child in the womb is life. And it's hypocritical to say now that a woman has control over that baby who is an independent person. And all of their propaganda doesn't matter. Just as the Nazis had propaganda to help you believe certain things about the Jews until they were not human anymore. They were subhuman, so now it didn't matter what happened to them. So there's propaganda that we've been hit with for the last 20 years, maybe even longer. And we've listened to the propaganda, and we've started to believe the propaganda, where Christians are even beginning to say, well, it's not a human. Well, what is it? As soon as it is conceived, it is a human life. It is a human that will come forth from that. It's certainly not a dog or a cat or a monkey. It's a human. There's nothing else that it is. And if the government recognizes that when someone kills someone who is pregnant, then they need to recognize it in the other way as well. Now, this is our moment. In the state of Arizona, it's going to become constitutional, which means it will not be overturned in November of 2024 unless we can make a stand and make a difference and let this not happen here. We're the first state to do that along with Ohio. I don't know what other states may try it then, but it's going to be tried in Arizona and Ohio. We are the heart of this battle right now. Do you know that Christians were involved in stopping slavery? Abolitionists were almost all Christians. There was a Christian movement with abolitionists. Do you know that slavery was legal before 1960 whatever, right? 1860 whatever, right? And do you know that the majority of people at certain times in America believed that it was okay? So believing something is right doesn't make it right. The majority believing that it's right doesn't make it right. We won over slavery, antebellum slavery, which was the worst kind of slavery this world had ever seen. Chattel slavery was the worst kind of slavery, and we won. Why'd we win? Because it was wrong. And abortion is wrong. Taking the life of a child is wrong. And we're going to win, I believe, because it is wrong. And this is your day. Where would you stand in slavery if you were alive in 1859? Would you be an abolitionist, or would you be one that thought, well, the economy of the plantations is really important and they have to have the slaves there to be able to do what they're doing, so we can't take away slavery? Where would you stand? And you say, well, I'd be an abolitionist. Where would you stand in Nazi Germany? Would you be the person who would say, well, you know what, I would protect the Jews. I would hide them in my home. I certainly wouldn't turn them in. I certainly wouldn't believe that they should be rounded up. But I wonder if you won't stand for life today for unborn babies who are the most innocent among them. Do you know in Jeremiah 19, God called the unborn children who are being sacrificed to Molech, God called them the innocents? This is why I say all babies go to heaven, because they are innocent. And God called them the innocent in Jeremiah chapter 11. And that means if you had a miscarried baby, some of the hardest thing you can go through, right? Those of you who've been through it, that you're going to see that baby again. You're going to see that child, probably not as a baby form, in heaven. And it means if you had an abortion, what are the statistics? 1 out of 4 women? I might not be correct on that. It might be 1 out of 3, a significant amount, which means some of you here have been involved in it. It's hard for you to hear this whole message today. It's hard for you to hear it. And there's been some of you guys here, and you encouraged women to have abortions, and you're feeling convicted about that even now. And maybe even you're kind of fighting against what's being said here because of your involvement for it. But I want you to know there is forgiveness for you. There is complete forgiveness for you. And just because you have that in your past doesn't mean you stand on the other side, what is the wrong side to fight this thing. And if you need help handling that, I'm going to send you to Hands of Hope. It's the Crisis Pregnancy Center that we support. And they have a support team. They have actual conferences. They have actually retreats that you can go to that are healing retreats, that if you have had an abortion in your life, you can go there and you can talk and seek and work things out and find the complete forgiveness for God. So you'll need to still stand on the right side. This is our time, okay? This is like we're alive in 1942. It's like we're alive in 1863. We're alive in this time. And it may be even a greater time than those days. Because, yes, slavery, 4 million slaves, am I right on that number? Okay, I'm pulling these out of my hat, okay? So I think 4 million slaves in the South, okay? In Germany, 6 million Jews plus others, maybe a larger number. In Russia, even more, right? Communism, even more than that. 65 million babies killed in America since Roe versus Wade. And listen, nobody wants to talk about this, but the majority of Planned Parenthoods are planted in minority communities, so that the majority of babies that are being aborted are minorities. We were talking about it last night, and Frank told me that in New York City, there are more black babies aborted than live births in New York City. No one's talking about that. No one's bringing those things up. So I'm going to ask you, which side will you stand on? If the Lord doesn't return for 100 years, will you be remembered as the person who said, I'm going to stand on the right side here? I'm not going to buy the propaganda. Have you already bought the propaganda? They hit it with you all over the place. It's in commercials. It's in movies, right? Everywhere you go, there's the propaganda. It's hitting you. The people bought it in Nazi Germany. The people bought it when it came to the slaves. Are you buying it today? You've got to ask yourself, if this government recognizes this in a baby in a woman's body as a life, when it comes to manslaughter, why does it change when a woman has a child in her? You know what this is? I'll just be quite frank with you. So if a woman has a different person inside of her and she can control what happens to that baby, they can do a D&C and they can cut that baby up and drag it out. She can take a pill, and we think that the abortion pill is you take an abortion pill and the baby goes away. She takes a pill, then she takes another pill, and then she gives birth to a dead baby. And you don't think that's traumatic for this woman and this girl that has to get rid of the dead baby? Now what has she got to do with that baby? What's she going to do? Flush it? She's going to bury it? What is she going to do? You don't think that she'll be marked by that? By herself in her bathroom alone with massive cramps, going through this without her parents knowing? Because you weren't told, because you don't need to be told, because they can give them the pills without you needing to be told. And these are the things that are being pushed. And we end up believing it. This is our day. This is the line. This is the demarcation. This is when we either stand on what's right or wrong. This is when we say we let our faith make a difference in what we do. So what do? Well, first of all, we vote. Secondly, we are not afraid to have conversations with people about this. Listen, it's going to get heated, and there are people who are heated. I have a sister. My sister is pro-life. And when we had a conversation a few years ago, she's pro-choice. She said to me, why would you vote for Trump? She's such a horrible guy. Why would you vote for a man like that? I said, can I respond to that? And she said, yes. And I said, I genuinely believe that the baby in a womb is a person who will have a life with joy and sorrow and pain and struggles that like anyone else. And what kind of a man would I be if I believed that that baby was a life and did nothing about it? And then I said, you want a brother like that? Now, she doesn't agree with me, but she at least understood. She said, I can understand. What do people want you to do if you really believe that a life is being taken? And what will you do if you really believe that a life is taken? Will you make that stand? Will you have those uncomfortable conversations? You don't need to, Greg Koukle's book, Tactic, is wonderful. He says, if anybody gets mad, you lose. So you can have conversations without it getting heated. You can bring it back from being heated. But we need to have these conversations. And we're going to need to be involved in politics. I always say we are issue-driven, not politics-driven. But we didn't bring this in. I didn't bring this into politics. They did. And so we'll deal with this issue, despite the fact that it's political. And we'll be talking about it a lot before the 2024 election. And we'll be doing a lot of things to do our part to make sure we stand on the right side. Just like slaves were saved by the train that went north, right? Just like Nazis were saved by Anne Frank's family, so we will save babies. We'll do what we have to do to make sure that there are babies. And if you've had an abortion, I pray God touches your heart, comforts you, and gets you forgiveness. You realize that we're living in this propaganda for a long time, but don't stand on the wrong side because of it. All right? So we need to go get over to the other side, the other campus, and do this one more time. God bless you guys. Stand strong. I love you, and I want to continue to stand with you as we fight against this. Next week, we'll be in Revelation. Next Wednesday night, next week, we're going to be looking at the Gentile Pentecost, Gentiles coming to Christ for the very first time. God bless you guys. Stand to your feet. Love you guys. We'll see you later on.